Howdy folks, it's me, Josh. World War I was easily one of, if not the single messiest conflict in human history, from how it started, to how it was fought, to how it ended. And one of the most glaring pieces of evidence for this is that, despite losing the war, the Germans had actually won in the Eastern Front as they forced the Russians to surrender and sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Russians refused to surrender and had stayed in World War I? So first, let's take a closer look at what actually led to Russia's surrender. In 1914, after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Austria would end up attacking Serbia. But this would end up threatening Russia's interest in the Balkans, as Russia would end up going to war with Austria, with Germany joining too in support of Austria, and France jumping in as well to honor their alliance with Russia. So, just like that, Germany was forced to fight a two-front war against France to the west and Russia to the east, which would greatly weaken their ability to fight as they were forced to split their forces. So, Germany's main strategy would be to concentrate its forces on one front, quickly knock out that side before moving their troops back and taking out the other. And upon the outbreak of the war, Germany would put this into practice with a plan. A Schlieffen Plan. The Germans had assumed that Russia would take a while to get its troops to the front, so while the Russians were getting ready, they would quickly invade France through Belgium before turning back to Russia. But, oops, turns out, Russia got ready a lot quicker than expected, and so Germany was forced to split their forces, ultimately keeping them locked in a brutal stalemate of a war for the next 4 years. But then, the Russian Revolution happened. Despite initial successes invading East Prussia and Austrian Galicia, the war would turn badly against the Russians as they were pushed back deep into their own territory. And to make things worse, the war had also drained a ton of Russia's resources, meaning the populace had to face harsh inflation and food shortages. So, due to this, as well as the fact that a creepy wizard was getting a bit too chummy with the Tsar, the Russian monarchy would end up being overthrown as a provisional government would be set up. But oops, the provisional government wanted to continue the war. So in response, the communist Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, would end up overthrowing the provisional government, setting up the Communist Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Wow, great name guys, really rolls off the tongue. But not everyone was really all that on board with the whole communism thing, so a bunch of anti-communist groups would all band together under the banner of the White Army, starting the Russian Civil War. So the Bolsheviks, not really able to fight both the Whites and the Germans at the same time, decided they needed to make peace with the Germans as soon as possible. The Germans, meanwhile, were freaking out. While all of this was going on, Germany had been steadily worn down by the fighting on the Western Front, and to make matters worse, the US had just decided to join the war against Germany. And the Germans knew that if they weren't able to force the Entente to surrender before the Americans arrived, they'd be toast. So, not really being able to fight the Bolsheviks and the Americans at the same time, the Germans decided they needed to make peace with the Bolsheviks as soon as possible. The Bolsheviks and Germans would end up signing an armistice at Brest-Litovsk, temporarily stopping the fighting while peace talks could be opened. However, during the peace talks, the Germans demanded pieces of land from Poland, the creation of a Polish rump state and several Baltic client states, as well as Soviet recognition of the independence of Ukraine, which had been fighting a war of independence, and renunciation of all territorial claims to Finland. This, to the Russians, was outrageous, not only because they'd be losing a crap ton of land and people, but also because much of that land was a major grain supplier to Russia, which they needed in order to help with the food shortages. So Leon Trotsky, the Soviet foreign minister, came up with a plan. Granted, it was a terrible plan, but a plan nonetheless. Trotsky believed that the Central Powers were on the brink of communist revolution, so he decided that Russia shouldn't surrender, but also shouldn't fight, hoping that either the Entente would join negotiations or the Germans would collapse. However, Trotsky couldn't stall forever though, as on February 18th, 1918, the armistice expired as fighting resumed. Well, fighting with an asterisk, as what ensued was what German General Max Hoffmann described as, quote, "the most comical war I have ever seen." The Germans had already sent most of their troops back to the west, so they put 53 divisions onto a bunch of trains, and since the Russians weren't fighting back, the German advance was basically just some German troops rolling up to a train station with a machine gun, whacking a bunch of Bolsheviks, taking the station, leaving, rinse and repeat. Just doing this, the Germans had managed to advance over 150 miles in the span of 1 week and got within 100 miles of Petrograd, which spooked the Soviets so much they moved the capital to Moscow. The Bolsheviks, meanwhile, were freaking out, as Lenin demanded that the Soviet government accept the German terms, threatening to resign if they didn't. And by a margin of 1 vote in the Central Committee, the Bolsheviks agreed to the terms by a vote of 7-6, as the final Treaty of Brest-Litovsk would be signed on March 3rd, 1918. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Bolsheviks had refused to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the war in the East had continued? After the Soviets' refusal to accept German terms, Lenin would resign his post, likely being succeeded by Trotsky. Not that it would matter though, as the Soviet government would be in complete chaos at this point and on the brink of collapse, with all it taking is a bunch of pissed off Germans literally steamrolling through Russia ready to end the war. The Germans, meanwhile, would just keep up what they had already been doing, pushing deeper and deeper into Russia, taking Petrograd by early March, and pushing all the way to Moscow by the end of the month, as the Bolsheviks offer practically zero resistance. And by the time the Germans make it to Moscow, they would promptly overthrow the uncooperative Soviet government, propping up a pro-German provisional government who they would then force to surrender. And also, with the Bolsheviks being quickly defeated, this would also mean that Tsar Nicholas II and the rest of his family wouldn't be murdered, as the Germans likely begin talks with him in order to prepare for a Romanov restoration. However, with Germany's eventual defeat at the hands of the Entente, this would inevitably fall through. The Whites, meanwhile, after the fall of the Bolsheviks, still wouldn't really want to submit to a German puppet government, but seeing the German defeat as inevitable, they would just bide their time, waiting for the Entente to secure victory against the Germans in order to take back control of the government. After the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, Brest-Litovsk would once again be nullified as the Whites seized power. And with the Whites not having to face a civil war against the Bolsheviks, Kolchak never takes power, and so instead, Russia ends up restoring the Russian Republic. However, with the chaos in Russia and the Whites, who would have been entirely dependent on the West at this point, not wanting to piss off the West by violating the self-determination of the separatists, Russia probably wouldn't invade Ukraine or the Caucasus. And even if they did invade, which is still very possible, I doubt they'd be as successful due to how disorganized the White Army was. So, as a result, Ukraine and the Caucasian republics survive, but later down the line, it's very likely that Russia would push to retake its lost lands. The Republic in Russia would end up extremely unstable. The Whites were very divided amongst themselves already, so the Republic would likely see Social Democrats, Conservatives, Tsarists, Nationalists, and Bolshevik remnants all vying for power. And with Russia's loss of so much valuable land in the West, this would greatly cripple the Russian economy as the country continues in its struggles with food shortages. In the end, after the war, Russia probably doesn't end up looking all that much different from Weimar Germany. Both suffered a terrible defeat in World War I, leading communists to overthrow the monarchy before the communists would be crushed, as a politically and economically unstable republic ends up in place. And once again, like in Germany, Russia would likely see a rise in authoritarianism as many see the need for a strong government to stabilize the country, retake lost lands, and restore the nation to its former glory. This rise in authoritarianism would take 2 forms. Firstly, there would be the Tsarists, who would push for a restoration of Nicholas II, who they see as the rightful emperor in order to restore the former splendor of the Russian Empire. And secondly, there would be fascists who would blame the former Tsarist government for Russia's defeat in World War I and would see a fascist dictatorship, akin to that of Mussolini's in Italy, as the only way to rebuild Russia. However, the Republic, which had already planned on doing so in our timeline, would very likely place Nicholas II in exile in the United Kingdom as he's unable to properly lead restorationist movements. And as the politically and economically unstable situation in Russia would lead many to see a restoration as unviable, the fascists would very likely grow in popularity, likely taking a hold of the country by the end of the 1920s. Again, a lot like Germany. Once the fascists take power, they would very likely begin a push for territorial expansion in order to reclaim Russia's lost territory, starting in the Caucasus and Ukraine. Hey, wait a minute, where have I seen this before? Anyways, the reason why I gave so much attention to the similarity between Russia's and Germany's situations is that it's very likely that the fascists in Russia would seek a close partnership with Germany as the two begin carving up Eastern Europe. After Russia's initial invasions of Ukraine and the Caucasus, it's once again very likely that the Russians would join in on a joint invasion of Poland, as the Russians soon after officially joined the Axis powers in World War II. However, Russia's friendliness towards the Germans wouldn't exactly be reciprocated. The Germans' whole deal during World War II was the idea of Lebensraum, meaning that the Germans should expand eastward, pushing out the Slavs, whom they saw as racially inferior. And so, with Britain's refusal to surrender after the fall of France, it's still very likely that Germany would stab the Russians in the back, launching Operation Barbarossa in order to invade Russia. With the German betrayal, Russia once again joins the Allies as the Germans are eventually defeated. And with this Russian victory against the Germans, the Russians once again push for greater influence in Europe and around the world. But without the Soviets, communism never rises to the same level of popularity it saw in our timeline, as Eastern Europe, China, and many more never fall to the ideology as fascism continues to survive. So, as Russia comes out of the war, the world begins to shape out drastically different than in our world. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to stick around for more. And hey, you could also, maybe, subscribe or something. So that's it for today's video. Well, till next time, see ya.